Northeastern. I'm also part of the PFAS research group at the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Ken Cook, the president and co-founder of the Environmental Working Group, is widely recognized as one of the environmental community's most prominent and influential critics of industrial agriculture, U.S. food and farm policy, and the nation's broken approach to protecting families and children from toxic substances. Under Cook's leadership, EWG has pioneered the use of digital technologies to empower American families with easy-to-use, data-driven tools to help reduce their exposure to potentially harmful ingredients in foods, drinking water, cosmetics, and other household products. Today, he will be speaking to us about the social and scientific discovery of PFASs as seen from the national organizational level. Please join me in welcoming Ken Cook.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Northeastern, for this amazing conference. I'm honored to be here. My colleague Dave Andrews is here as well, and I've learned a lot this morning and recollected a lot this morning. I hope everyone can manage to stay warm here. That'll help you stay awake, but I hope you don't need that help. I'm going to talk a little bit about how EWG got involved in this fight going back many years and try and draw some lessons, I hope, for what is ahead of us, because as Linda said and others said, this is going to be a problem we're going to be facing for many years, not just the onslaught of the new chemicals that are going to be coming onto the market to perform many of the same functions that PFOA and PFOS performed in the industrial sector, but also because of the legacy of all these chemicals that contaminate the living world. The entire living world is contaminated with these chemicals. That's what biosphere is. And this is a biospheric tragedy. If you ever come to the Environmental Working Group, and I would hope someday, if those of you who haven't been able to come will come, you'll see a couple of posters on the walls, very large, that we've blown up of documents. You'll see one from Anniston, Alabama, that describes how PCB contamination has been found near Monsanto's plant, and how the state agency is colluding with Monsanto not to tell anybody about it, decades before the crisis broke and even before PCBs were banned by the Toxic Substances Control Act in 76. You'll see a document from an asbestos industry executive telling people that sure, asbestos is probably causing people to die, but if you've made a good living using asbestos, why not die from it? These are some of the documents you'll see on our walls, and this is another one. I think this maybe came, I'll be talking about this later. Rob, did this come out of your discovery? Well, yeah, so that's a part of the story I'm going to go into, but this is just a single page. It's on the wall of our first floor conference room at EWG, and it's a summary of the results of a study that DuPont did of women who are on the line, the factory line in Parkersburg, who were pregnant and had kids. And you'll see there, a couple of notes that we'll touch on a little bit later. These are the levels that they found of C8 in the blood of these women workers. They later returned them to the line. They were allowed to go back, I think, and work after a period of time when they were taken away. But you'll see that they noticed several problems with two of the children in this list. One, nostril and eye defect, and an unconfirmed eye and tear duct effect. Exactly the effects you would have predicted from studies that had been done in animals before then. But the reason we even got into this, and the reason that document is now poster size on our wall, is because of reporting by this gentleman in May of 2017. Oops, sorry about that. May of 2017. Sorry. where there was a study that came out, an announcement that came out from 3M that caught my eye. And it said that 3M was going to take a $200 million loss in that 1 year against its bottom line because it had decided to voluntarily take some of the chemistry associated with Scotchgard off the market. Scotchgard, Heloise used to spray Scotchgard on her husband's necktie, apparently a very sloppy eater, to keep it clean. You know, the cultural familiarity with Scotchgard, and then of course Teflon was a big part of the story for us early on, because we couldn't quite believe that something that was inert, something that was kept things clean, that shed oil, shed water. The reputation culturally of this was an extraordinarily desirable product, right? We weren't sure we could take this on, so the first story was that they're just taking this off the market. And then the second story on 5/19, 2 days later, is very different. Same reporter, David Barboza from the New York Times. And what has happened in the 2 days is someone from EPA has called and said, you know, that's not really how it went. 3M didn't volunteer to take it off. I think I know who that made that call, but I'm not going to say his name out loud. And in this story, which fronted the business section and was much longer, the previous one was sort of like almost like a 3M press release, slightly touched up, was dramatic. And I read that story in my office, and I called my colleague Jane Houlihan in and said, we have got to look into this, because this stuff is showing up in people, it's showing up in wildlife around the globe, and I'd like to know where all this information came from. So we started digging, and we started finding that there was a trail of emails we got from EPA describing the process of discovery within the agency in the late 1990s about this extraordinary set of studies that had been done by 3M and later by DuPont, and Rob spoke to several of those, that showed all kinds of problems. They were finding, the first 3M announcement said it can show up in people. It turned out that when they were trying to do worker studies, they wanted to compare the workers at the 3M plants to the unexposed population. So they tested the blood of the workers and then compared it to the unexposed population, but there was no unexposed population. The unexposed population came from blood that was archived by recruits to the U.S. Army for the Korean War. That blood was clean. But all the other blood they tested, including children's blood around the country, was contaminated with this shit. Okay? So around this time, this is the famous lamented late Theo Colborn, who was a very dear friend and colleague. And Theo got me into so much trouble over the years, I can't even begin to tell you. And some of the trouble she got me into was telling me that there was this big kerfuffle at EPA because there was this lawyer out in Ohio, in West Virginia, who was trying to warn everybody about this chemical that was in water everywhere. It was the same chemical that was the subject of the David Barboza piece, and another one called PFOA. DuPont had tried to stifle him, it was Rob, from making information available. And she said, you and your EWG team, she was at World Wildlife Fund at the time, you should take this on. And so I think she had she knew EWG from the get-go in 1993. She knew how we worked. I sent a couple of scientists to go look at the docket for this compound at EPA, and that's when the race was on. This is, Rob is a very modest guy. This was a great story in the New York Times. I will tell you that, at least from our perspective at EWG, if it hadn't been for his ferocity, his sense of ethics, his sense of moral responsibility, and his desire to make sure that this problem was solved not just for his plaintiffs, which is the lawyer's duty, but for the broader world, we we wouldn't be where we are now in at least combating this. We wouldn't have had the victories that we have had. So I just want to... So one of the early contacts we had was with a guy named Bob Griffin. And that one of the themes in my talk is that individual people standing up like so many of you are now, and I love the introduction you gave to all the community groups and the individuals in those groups. That's what makes the difference. And let me just tell you, it's just about all we've got. If you don't stand up yourself, if you see a problem and you don't do what's in your power to do something about it, you just can't count on agencies to do the right thing. You can't count on companies to do the right thing. You can't count on local politicians to do the right thing. You have to make it happen. Bob Griffin, the manager at Little Hocking Water Association, as we started looking into this, one of the first things we came across was his concern that this stuff was in his water. You know, DuPont sent scientists to general stores and other places. Rob went over quickly, but imagine, you know, you're sending your technicians and your scientists out. They're taking samples. In one case, I think they said they were collecting the water. The radiator was low, so when they wanted a jug of water from a general store, they took it back to the lab and they found these really high levels. In the case of Little Hocking, what really upset them was not just that they were serving their people this water, but that they had gone to the trouble of establishing a new well field in the Ohio River. This is right across from Parkersburg. A new well field, and really built up their community water system with state revolving loan funds funded by the federal government. And they had drilled into the aquifer that DuPont already knew was contaminated. And no one said a word. No one said a word. At this point, DuPont was making sure that it's inside the plant they kept levels low and were filtered so that their own workers wouldn't be exposed to the levels that were freely exposed there. This was a statement that Little Hocking issued in January 23rd, 2002. And just to pull out a little bit of it for you, a separate team of government, industry, and public health scientists headed by the West Virginia. What did I say? What's West Virginia? Is working to establish a safe number for human exposure to CA. And this is Little Hocking right? And so when they say safe number, they're mocking the agency across the river, as they might. In the interim, as a precaution, the Little Hocking Water Association voluntarily took the water well that showed the highest level of C8 detection out of service indefinitely. I'm doing it. Little Hocking, we're going to take care of our people. We're not going to count on you to do it for us because we don't have much reason to believe it's going to work. One of the reasons we got into this early on was because we were following this amazing reporter, had been for many years, Ken Ward, from the Charleston Gazette-Mail. I wish Ken was here that we could applaud him in person. And I have to give a shout out to Callie Lyons, I think she is also here. Are you here, Callie? We did this amazing reporting.
Callie is not coming.
Oh, she's not coming? Oh, I'm so sorry, because I wanted to make sure she had a shout out as well. There were reporters who got a hold of this story and would not let go. And think about it, in this day and age, how journalism is so maligned, and the search for truth and unearthing it, no matter how painful, is considered to be something that our president wants to criminalize, to get rid of the laws that protect journalists from doing that. Anyway, Ken Ward, and he's still reporting on it. It's a recent story. In early 2000, late 2002, we've been reading enough of the information that was in the EPA docket at that point. The 8E docket. This is the docket, the section of the EPA files where they list under the Toxic Substances Control Act all the information that companies are supposed to report or were supposed to report if they did a study and they found some reason to be concerned, right? So in 2002, reading some of these files showing water contamination and showing that the companies had secretly tested people around the country and found this contaminant in all of them, especially little kids, we wrote to the CDC and said, start adding these perfluorinated chemicals to your biomonitoring program. And as Linda said, there's now a long list, but this was the first request that went in because we thought we needed a baseline here. We needed to understand what is going on with these chemicals in human beings. And then here are some of the results, the first results that came out. And lo and behold, this is the percentage of the population that they found this stuff in. Okay? It inspired us to do something else, which was to go out and do our own umbilical cord blood testing, a fairly, simple survey study, 10 babies. We got the cord blood through the American Red Cross. PFOS and PFOA were some of the chemicals that we tested for. We found it in all 10 babies, plus we found over 200 other toxic chemicals, including some that had been banned 30 years before, and were still showing up in those babies because, as Linda said, they don't leave the environment. I mean, it was the internal documents that came out of DuPont and 3M in particular described PFOS and PFOA as geologically stable. Geologically stable. What? Sunlight didn't break them down, bacteria didn't break it down, lack of oxygen didn't break it down, nothing seemed to break it down. But there it was out there. We may have played a role in introducing the PFC deal. I'm sorry about that, but we're fixing it. You're fixing it for us. But we started issuing report after report after report and story after story, release and statement every time something showed up, because Rob, whenever he won a discovery fight against DuPont, and it was cleared by the court, and he kicked their ass in court and won I think every discovery fight practically you faced, you won. He then sent it to the EPA docket. So it was suddenly public. Sometimes we hear that there was a new infusion of documents at the EPA docket, and by that time it was online. We didn't have to send someone over with a CD and copy it. And so we started releasing these reports, and we can't find the actual final one, so this says author 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but that tells you something in the world of EWG. When there are 5 authors on one of our papers, that means a big part of the organization, which was true during these years, was devoted to bird dogging this issue of these perfluorinated chemicals. We just couldn't believe what we were reading, and we weren't reading it as a result of anything other. Well, first of all, we knew what we'd been reading for years in the culture, the presentation of Teflon and Scotchgard and so forth. But we were hearing from the companies that everything was okay. There was no real problem. Nothing to indicate hazard of toxicity, any risk whatsoever. DuPont remains confident, blah, blah, blah. Our products are safe. No evidence to suggest increases in reproductive development, and so forth and so on, right? All these statements from the company over and over and over. No known adverse effects. No. There were known adverse effects in their own files, and they didn't tell anybody. Now, if you did go to the official source of information that you got when a new chemical was introduced to EPA for approval under the Toxic Substances Control Act, you came to a document something like this, right? This is, it's unreadable. You're welcome. It's pretty much unreadable when you have it right in front of you. But even if it weren't unreadable, it's all redacted or left blank under confidential business information. This is the trade name, the generic name, the company identifier, the manufacturer, the distributor, basic information, emergency information, CVI, right? Product information completely. This is a fluoroalkyl acrylate. It's a fluorinated chemical. And I think Daikin originally had the patent for it, going way back in the 80s, but here it's showing up in an MSDS application. Physical and chemical properties, there you go, CBI. These are the list of attachments. These are pre-manufactured notice substance. These are tests that have been conducted voluntarily by the company. They weren't required at that time under TSCA to conduct any of these tests, but all the results and all the underlying data are confidential business information, meaning only EPA can look at it. We can't look at it. And obviously EPA had been looking at these kinds of documents for many years. They didn't really learn anything meaningful about PFOA and PFOS until the court documents that started coming out as a result of what Rob was doing got into the document. So the story that you would see, and this is probably Parkersburg's facility looking its very best at night, was very different than what Rob was finding in his trial work, such as this study that showed two out of 8 kids with the exact harm you would expect based on the animal studies. And this is one of those kids, Bucky Bailey. We got to know Bucky. I think we met him probably through Rob. He was one of the kids. He came to Washington, D.C., as did, and testified with us, did lobbying visits with us, tried to tell everybody what was going on in West Virginia. He was very courageous to do it. He's a wonderful man. At that point, I guess he was in his 30s. And he came and just was stand up. And Mr. Griffith came also from Little Hocking. Just came right to D.C. and we took him around to all his senators and members of Congress, Henry Waxman, the members of the Committee of Jurisdiction and so forth, to raise concerns about not just this chemical in this incident, but the broken safety net. We filed the only provision under the original TSCA that we thought had any teeth was the 8E provision. This was where if a company failed to disclose information to the EPA, that they had done some study that showed harm, and Rob mentioned that there were 2 clear sets of evidence there. They found the study, the one-page study I showed you before, showing harm in human beings born to women who worked at Parkersburg, identical to the predicted harm from the animal studies, and then the water contamination. So we filed an 8E petition that led to the lawsuit by EPA against DuPont, and this was during the Bush administration. We were rather surprised that Administrator Whitman, I think by that time maybe she was on her way out, but they went forward with this case. There was later, by the way, the Justice Department did impanel a grand jury to criminally investigate DuPont, but they did not return an indictment, just as a sidelight. Then we started, everything that came out in this story got weirder and weirder. So we found out quite by happenstance that there were all these people who had pet birds who died when fumes in the kitchen got into the vicinity of their pet birds. They just keel over in their cages and foam coming out of their mouth and they'd be dead. And this was a version of Teflon toxicosis that workers would experience, the flu-like symptoms, but with birds they were fatal. So we did a press conference where we brought in bird breeders, all of whom knew all about the Teflon problem. They got cease and desist orders from DuPont not to talk about it, because after all, birds could also be killed by fans in your home. So there are other risks too that they were ignoring by focusing on, so this is in our high-end laboratory at EWG. This is Chris Campbell demonstrating that within minutes of leaving a pan on a stove, a Teflon pan on a stove, it would get to the temperature that in the literature we saw would result in the release of these gases and particles from a Teflon or PFTE, a nonstick pan. This is Chris conducting that experiment. We also had a food scientist, food technologist at a university conduct a parallel one under probably more controlled conditions than our kitchen. But this was just very clear evidence that in the real world, people were experiencing canaries in the coal mine, except in the kitchen, who were, in some cases, it was dramatic. People had entire collections of these animals who happened to be in their homes, and they bought the wrong oven with a Teflon liner, or they left, who hasn't left a pan on the stove? That's what DuPont said, well, you're not, when you use the pan as directed, Teflon pans as directed, it's not gonna be a problem. Or, if you put it on the stove and don't put food in it immediately, it's really kind of your fault, right? So this is what they would say to these, and sometimes they would lose dozens of birds in just one incident. So this was a study we did, and we brought people in, we showed the speed at which one of these Teflon pans could heat up, and all the particles from the literature that came off and gases that came off at the different temperatures. These were all stories in the newspaper. All stories in the Delaware paper. We made sure DuPont's hometown paper started publishing them. We made sure, obviously, Ken Ward, when we had something, we were often racing Ken for the same story, but he was so good. Oh, he's so good. He would often beat us. But I got to tell you, we just couldn't believe story after story. We had a story reported about the time DuPont decided to test Teflon inhalation problems and any health problems might result by testing beagles, having beagles smoke cigarettes that had been treated with Teflon. And when that didn't work so well, they just decided to use workers and did human studies on the workers to see what problems might emerge, right? And none of this was published. None of this came to light until Rob forced them to divulge it. Mike Hawthorn from the Columbus Dispatch, another great reporter. I keep mentioning reporters because, for obvious reasons now, right? This was a time people still had memories of the Teflon president, Ronald Reagan, right? Nothing stuck to him, right? Yeah. Now we have sort of the Velcro president. But anyway, everything sticks to him, and rightly so. This is the memorandum that announced the voluntary agreement. We were hammering DuPont. We were meeting with DuPont pretty much monthly at that point. They came to meet with us. They wanted to tell us that we were, our science was wrong. They wanted to correct us. They wanted to explain to us what was really happening, that they were moving as quickly as they could. But their own documents were killing them. I mean, they had a lawyer working for DuPont who used his work computer to write a note to his son who was away at college, and he said something to the effect, I wouldn't drink this water either if it were me. Well, that, Rob defeated their attempts to keep that out of the record, and when we got a hold of that, of course, we published it, and the lawyer called us and said, can you please take it down off your website? We weren't able to help him with that. What they knew that it's the same with PCBs. It's the same with MTBE. It's the same story with all these chemicals. They talk to the engineers in the company, and the engineers say, well, yeah, we can figure something else out. We're engineers. If no one told us you wanted safe. You said you wanted cheap and a lot. So that's what we made. And the business people are saying, well, if we transition out, do it the right way, but it's still going to be like a penny a barrel more, and who wants to give up that good money? And then the lawyers are always, well, the big problem is we can't ever admit that anything was ever wrong. And just like 3M's original announcement, they just moved on. They took this $200 million loss against their bottom line just because it was the right thing to do. Because it could show up in people and some wildlife. And customers wanted an alternative. Customers were demanding an alternative. But this is the agreement that got U.S. And several other manufacturers out of the PFOA and PFOS business. We all know, we knew at the time, just how limited this impact would be. We see here the Columbus Dispatch, more great reporting. They've continued to cover the story as this lawsuit settled. We know that PFOA levels have started to go down. Linda had a slide. This is arguably a prettier one. Obviously, they've been studying the problem in Norway before we studied it. Norway, where they, I guess maybe they had facilities, but the U.S. was sound asleep while Norway was finding this. It's always some Norwegian or Danish guy, right, that turns on his machine and says, "What's that?" And then the whole world wakes up to it, and we suddenly have this global catastrophe. That was the PCBs, the same thing, right? It came from studies in Scandinavia, the first sign that it was in everything. Same with PFAS, right? So I'm not saying this is bad. I'm glad the levels are going down, but we have no idea if the levels they're going down to are safe. We have every reason to believe that they're probably not. They're still in all of us. They will be in all of us probably for decades, so far as we know. When the companies decided to settle voluntarily with EPA to stop production of PFAS and PFOA in the United States, they made a big deal out of it, and DuPont said in here that they did want to stop making this stuff because they didn't want chemicals showing up in people's blood. Now, to me, that was a high point of an understanding, if not a reckoning, on the part of DuPont, that just as the problem is not going to go away in the sense of haunting us with persistence and toxicity decades and decades into the future, it was not going to go away for DuPont either. And if there was any company that had a chance of probably inventing technologies and chemistries that would not cause all of these problems, it might be DuPont going forward, I would argue, of all of them. Possibly even 3M, ironically. But they had these terrible legacies that they did such a terrible job managing and were so dishonest and unethical about, it made it very difficult to expect that they would do better, although I think they have the capability. And my quote at the time in the Washington Post, and I'll just read it, "What's the appropriate fine for a $25 billion company that for decades hid vital health information about a toxic chemical that now contaminates every man, woman, and child in the United States? What's the appropriate fine? What's the proper dollar penalty for a pollutant that will never break down and now finds its way into polar bears in the Arctic and human babies in their mother's wombs? We're pretty sure it's not 16 million bucks, even if that is a record amount under a federal law that everyone acknowledges is extremely weak." So this is the point. This is in 2005, I guess, where we know this problem is going to continue. We're using it to try and spark debate over the Toxic Substances Control Act. But there's been tremendous work going forward, and I want to give a shout out to Keep Your Promises. We've had the pleasure of working on a number of occasions with this great organization. They've continued to keep the fight going with DuPont in a way that I think is exemplary, and I wanted to make sure I gave them a shout out too. Again, individuals who've decided that they're going to stand up. We heard a little bit earlier today about this latest effort to start mapping this chemicals, this scourge. And then I just want to go back to some of the people. To me, these are some of the heroes who stood up and made this fight happen. They made it possible for EWG to talk about what's really important here, which is people, not chemicals, not chemical structures, not its applications, not jobs, not anything other than what these chemicals mean to people. And because the damage is so widespread and it's going to last for so long, it's especially important, I think, to acknowledge that individual people decided to do their jobs at Little Hocking or at the New York Times or at the Columbus Dispatch or Ken Ward at his desk at his newspaper. They just decided to do their job, and they were not going to let go until they had some measure of satisfaction. And then they weren't going to let go even then, because they knew that as this story unfolded, it was really the poster child for what's wrong with the way we go about making chemicals, handling them responsibly, irresponsibly, how we go about with our own neighbors doing the wrong thing when the least you can do is grant them their right to know that a product you're making could make them sick and they are exposed to it day in and day out. The least they could do. So we have a lot of fight ahead. We are happy warriors at EWG, which means we're really pissed, but we smile. And I'm just here to tell you, we're sticking with this, as it were. We are not going to let go of this set of issues because it is so important for all of us to understand that this is just not only the tip of the iceberg, but this is the system we have to figure out how to fix. As Rob said, we have a way of dealing with legally now that he's pioneered, taking action to get some justice for the people who've been harmed. We don't yet have, especially in this new toxics law, we do not have the legal mechanism, the legislative and regulatory mechanisms to fix the problem. That is yet to be discovered. And I see all these young people out here, all these community activists out here. If anyone's going to discover it, it's you. Thank you. A couple of questions. Any? Okay. Yes?
So you've concentrated mostly on the U.S.
Yeah, we concentrate on the U.S.
Do you know if there's any organizations like yours working globally?
Oh, I think a lot of groups. I mean, when this started, I mean, I don't say this, I'm not bragging about it, everyone's busy. We were the only group working on it nationally in the U.S. And then I think, I would guess the second group that got into it is Ohio Citizen Action. But that's my recollection. If I'm off, someone please correct me. And we had PhD scientists who could do the work. We had investigative reporters and savage media people who could keep it going. I've seen great work come out of Europe on this. I think World Wildlife Fund, Friends of the Earth, others have done some terrific stuff in Europe. I'm not so sure what might be going on in China, and I regret that I don't have the name of I can't identify those organizations. But I know that obviously, if you saw the New York Times story, I guess it was on the cover of the Sunday Times, the story about, or was it yesterday's paper, the story about pollution in China, horrifying, right? Lead. I mean, we're still dealing with lead. Since Roman times, we're dealing with lead. And that was the story that was told in China. So there's a lot to work on going back to elements, much less these things that are introduced by commerce without a thought, without really much thought. We have whistleblowers at DuPont and 3M that I still don't name that helped us a lot, told us what was really known inside 3M early on. They knew all of this for decades, you know? They knew all of this. I mean, you don't put cigarettes in the mouths of beagles unless you're worried about something, right? You don't teach beagles to smoke unless you're thinking maybe there might be an issue that needs to be explored. So they knew all about it all. Yes, sir. Sorry. Someone have a question over there?
Ken, thank you, and thanks for the shout out. And Jeff Davis from Keep Your Promises DuPont.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joe Kiger as well, one of our community leaders. Somebody mentioned the international angle here. We've been in contact with some groups in the Netherlands where there's a sister plant in Dordrecht. Very similar issues have been revealed there. Frighteningly similar, actually. In addition, there's another sister plant in Shimizu, Japan. And you alluded to some of the problems in China. So it's a worldwide issue at this point. The question that I want to pose and that we put forward in an email to most of the attendees before this conference is there's clearly momentum building here. The scope of the problem is coming to light and more and more people are waking up to the issue. But we're still massively under-resourced and underfunded. How do we translate the growing awareness and momentum into an apparatus that can actually combat companies like DuPont?
Good question, and I'll for an example of how underfunded we are, not to put Linda on the spot, but although it's not the first time I've done that. In fairness, you're used to it. But under $10 million for some of that extramural research, when we could use 10 times that to explain. I know that's not your fault. You would gladly spend more if you had it, but that's at the federal government level. I think we are under-resourced in environmental health generally, in my view, across the board. Everything from community organizations trying to do their work like yours to groups like EWG. We were spending pretty much half or more of our entire science budget in the early 2000s there just on this issue. And I had 3 or 4 PhDs working on it full time, so that we felt like when we went in and talked to EPA, we were on top of our game as best we could. And thank goodness we had all the information that was coming out of the internal secret documents, because EPA's own official files had nothing other than what Rob was dumping into them. But it was very difficult to raise money then, very difficult to raise money now. I will say though that people respond to this. We've since built a social media and an email system, as you all have, and so we have a way that we didn't have back in 2000 to really test day to day, are people interested in this? And they are. People want to avoid this. They do want, to the degree they can, to take steps on their own to avoid exposure. And while it is true, and we've said it for 20 years, you can't shop your way out of some of these problems. Some of them are societal or systemic, and sometimes you'll stop buying one bad thing only to unwittingly, unknowingly buy a bad substitute. I mean, environmental policy writ large is regrettable substitution still, right? You can't pick a category where we're still not making a bad choice to go from coal to fracked gas or coal to nuclear or what have you, until you get these bigger solutions like truly renewable energy or organic agriculture or something like that does away with the whack-a-mole. You're stuck. But we don't have. We have popular interest. We have our consumer audience follows us closely. They're interested in every single missive we send out. But we don't have the foundation community still lying behind this. I think the move toward focusing on climate change, while totally justified, has left a lot of passion behind, where people can really connect. And to me, we see in our work, people come to us and they want to buy a healthier mascara, right, through our Skin Deep site that rates cosmetic products. And before we know it, they're wanting to find out more information about what's in their drinking water. They want to know how to eat healthier. They want to sign up to help us protect the food stamp program from deep cuts that would leave kids hungry. There's a ladder of engagement here, and I feel like environmental health is one that we have underinvested in, to the peril of issues that are harder to grasp, like climate change. That's just my editorial comment.